After my husband's funeral, my boss said I needed to prove I was still stable enough for work. Then he made me train the woman who slept with him while I was planning the funeral. She smirked and said, "Don't worry, I'm not here to take everything." Later. I smiled, because my husband. 35 female, just buried my husband, Tom, and started coming back to work after taking time off. The first day back, my boss, who's always been decent, pulled me into his office and said he needed me to prove I was still stable enough to handle my job. Then, he threw me into training a woman named Avery. Turns out, she was the one who had been sleeping with Tom while I was planning his funeral. She came in with this smug look on her face, like everything was fine. She actually said to me, "Don't worry, I'm not here to take everything." I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was shaking. I don't know how, but somehow I survived it. But I'm still trying to figure out what I'm supposed to feel, and how to move on. Here's the whole mess. I didn't know how to walk back into the office after Tom's funeral. How do you go from burying the love of your life to sitting at a desk, crunching numbers? It felt like an impossible shift. But life doesn't stop just because you're grieving. I had 2 kids to raise, a job to get back to, and a future I didn't even know how to face. When I walked into the office that first day back, I barely recognized it. Everything felt surreal, like I was seeing it through a fog. The usual hum of computers and hushed conversations seemed too loud, too jarring. Greg, my boss, had called me into his office the minute I sat down at my desk. I wasn't sure if I was ready for a conversation, but there was no avoiding it. Greg's office smelled like expensive cologne and overused air fresheners, and as soon as I stepped inside, the tension was thick. He looked at me for a second, then went straight into it. No small talk, no empathy, just a cold, businesslike tone. "I know this is a tough time for you, Catherine," Greg said, his voice flat. "But we're going to need you to get back on track. We've all had to cover for you while you've been gone, but we need you back in the game." I blinked, trying to process his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've been gone for a while, and we need you to prove that you're still capable of doing your job," Greg continued. "I understand you've been through a lot, but we can't let things slip. The team relies on you." My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the armrests of the chair. I'd just buried my husband. How was I supposed to prove anything to anyone? I felt like I was drowning, and here he was, asking me to perform. "I lost my husband, Greg," I said quietly, trying to keep the emotions from breaking through. "I don't know how to just snap back." He didn't respond to that, just nodded as if he'd expected it. "I understand, but we need to see if you're still mentally stable enough for the workload." Stable enough? I didn't even know if I was stable enough to breathe. "Also," he added, standing up, "we've made some adjustments while you were away. There's a new hire. Her name's Avery. You'll be working with her. Training her." I didn't think much of it at first. But then I followed him out of the office and saw her standing by my desk. My stomach dropped. Avery was young, sharp-looking, with that overly confident air that always made me uncomfortable. She smiled at me as I walked up to her, and something in the way she did it made me want to recoil. "Hi, Catherine. I've heard so much about you," she said, her voice almost sickeningly sweet. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Nice to meet you." Avery leaned in to shake my hand, but there was something off about the whole exchange. I had never met her before, but I knew exactly who she was. She was the woman who had been with Tom. The woman I'd caught hints of, the woman who I now had to work with. I had no idea how long they'd been seeing each other, but I'd seen the signs. The late nights, the texts, the excuses. It was all clear now. Too clear. I didn't want to train her. I didn't want to look at her, talk to her, or even be in the same room as her. But I had no choice. I needed the paycheck. I had children to care for. So, I bit my tongue and forced myself to sit beside her. Avery was talkative, asking questions about the work, acting all eager to learn. Every time she leaned over my desk, her perfume, Tom's scent, lingered in the air. It made me nauseous, but I couldn't say anything. What could I say? I know you were sleeping with my husband while I planned his funeral? Yeah, that wasn't going to fly. But there was one moment, one sentence that I can still hear in my head. After a long day of training, when I felt the weight of it all crashing down, Avery leaned back in her chair and gave me that same smug smile she always wore. I wanted to slap it off her face. Don't worry, Catherine, she said, with an almost playful tone. I'm not here to take everything. You still have your family, right? I froze. My entire body went cold. It was like she was daring me to react. But I stayed silent. What else could I say? The truth? That she had already taken something that could never be replaced? That the life I had built was gone in the blink of an eye? I looked at her, my heart beating faster, but I didn't say a word. Instead, I forced a smile. I'm not worried, I said, trying to sound calm. I'm just here to do my job. She didn't seem satisfied by that answer, but she didn't push it further. The next few days were more of the same. I trained her, made sure she understood the processes, but all the while I was battling this internal war. Avery was playing a game, and she was winning. I couldn't help but feel like I was losing. My mind was filled with thoughts of betrayal, anger, and confusion. How could she act like nothing had happened? How could she just move on with her life while mine had fallen apart? But I was trying, desperately, to hold myself together. For my kids. For my own sanity. A week later, I found myself in Greg's office again. This time, there was no small talk. He got straight to the point. Catherine, we've been talking, and we think it's time we made a decision, Greg said, tapping his pen on the desk. We've been considering moving in a new direction. My stomach turned, but I didn't interrupt. What do you mean? I asked, already knowing the answer. We're going to have to let you go, Greg said, his eyes meeting mine for the first time during the entire conversation. Avery's been doing great, and we think she's the better fit for the role. I stared at him, dumbfounded. My breath caught in my throat. Let me go? I couldn't even fathom what he was saying. Greg, what are you talking about? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You've been out for too long, Greg said. And while I understand what you've been through, we need to make sure that the company moves forward. Avery's ready. You're not. I felt my heart shatter. My chest constricted, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. My husband was gone. My job was gone. What was left? I stood up, not knowing how to respond. How could I fight this? Greg didn't seem to notice my internal struggle. He just looked at me, waiting for me to pack up and leave. But before I could even process what had just happened, I heard Avery's voice from behind me. Catherine, she called out. You okay? Don't worry, I'm not here to take everything. I turned around, facing her for the first time in days. She was standing there, smiling, so damn smug. And in that moment, something in me snapped. Without saying a word, I walked out of Greg's office, my mind reeling. I walked back to my desk with the weight of Greg's words still crushing my chest. My head was spinning. Everything was happening too fast, and I felt like I was losing control. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on the computer screen in front of me. The words were blurry. The world around me was blurry. Avery was still there, watching me, though she tried to hide it. I could feel her eyes on me from the corner of my vision. Her presence was suffocating, like she was waiting for me to break. Every time she came close, I could smell her perfume again. Tom's cologne lingered faintly on her skin, and I had to fight the overwhelming urge to turn and walk out the door. But I didn't. I stayed. Because I had no choice. It was a battle, day by day, trying to keep it together. The job, the betrayal, the grief, it was all too much. I wanted to scream at Avery, to call her out for what she had done, but I didn't. I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to do anything but hold it in. I wanted to break, but I needed to stay functional. For my kids, for my future. Every day I trained her, telling myself I could get through this. I didn't know how, but I would. I had to. There were moments when I'd glance over at Avery, her perfect hair, her too casual posture, and it made me want to throw up. She didn't even seem remorseful. It was like she was doing this out of some twisted sense of triumph, like she had won. At the end of the week, when the office was quieter, I found myself alone with her in the break room. She was sipping on her coffee, leaning against the counter, looking like she had everything under control. I couldn't take it anymore. "Avery," I said, my voice sharp despite the calm I was trying to keep. She turned to look at me, eyebrows raised. "What's up?" I hesitated, but then, the words tumbled out, unfiltered, angry, and raw. "You know, it's funny. You and we've never really had the chance to talk about things." She blinked, her expression unreadable. "Things?" "Yeah," I said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "Things like how long you were with Tom. How long this thing was going on behind my back while I was at home, planning his funeral. How long you've been playing this little game." Avery set her cup down slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. There was something almost amused in her eyes, like she wasn't expecting me to call her out. But I did. "I didn't plan this," she said quietly, but I could hear the edge in her voice. "It wasn't my idea. But you're right. It happened." She paused, then added, "And Tom, well, you weren't the only one who needed someone." I felt my chest tighten. The words stung, even though I knew they were true. But hearing her speak so calmly about it, so casually, felt like a slap across the face. "And you think that makes it okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That he was your someone while I was at home, grieving, trying to hold everything together? You think it's okay to just waltz in here like nothing happened?" She looked down at her hands, as though pondering my question, but when she looked up again, the smugness had returned. "It doesn't matter now, does it? He's gone. We can't change what happened." The coldness in her words made me want to scream, but I held it together. "I don't need your sympathy, Avery," I said, forcing myself to stand tall, even though I felt anything but strong. "But I won't let you sit here, pretending you didn't know exactly what you were doing. And don't think for one second that I'll just forget." I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, a faint smile still tugging at the corners of her lips. It didn't make sense, none of it did. But I had to walk away. For my own sanity, I had to keep some distance. Over the next few days, things between Avery and me didn't change. She would still ask questions, still smile that sickeningly sweet smile at me every now and then. But I stopped reacting. I'd already said what I needed to say. Now, all I had to do was survive. Then, Greg called me into his office again. It had been a week since the conversation about Avery taking over my position, and I'd been dreading this moment. Part of me had hoped that it had all been a bad dream, but I knew better. I knew it wasn't over. I walked into Greg's office, steeling myself for whatever was next. He looked up as I sat down, his expression serious. "Catherine, we've decided to make it official. We're promoting Avery to your role. You've been with the company for a long time, but the decision is final." I felt a knot twist in my stomach. It was happening. I was being replaced by her. I opened my mouth to speak but stopped myself. What was the point? Greg wasn't going to change his mind, and I couldn't force him to see things from my perspective. This was business. It wasn't personal, or at least, that's what they told me. "You're still welcome to stay with the company," Greg added, as though trying to soften the blow. "But we'll need you to transition into a different role, maybe something more part-time. We can talk through the details." Part-time. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. My body was exhausted. I wanted to tell Greg exactly what I thought, but I couldn't find the words that wouldn't sound desperate or pathetic. So I just nodded. "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. Greg didn't seem to notice my internal turmoil. He was already flipping through papers, looking for the next task to discuss. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly as I walked out of his office. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me with every step. This wasn't just about my job, it was about everything I had lost. Tom. My future. My identity. It was all slipping away, piece by piece. As I passed Avery's desk on the way back to mine, she looked up at me, her eyes gleaming. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her expression. The triumph. The sense of victory. I could feel my heart sink. But then, unexpectedly, something else happened. I didn't break. I didn't crumble. I smiled. And not in a bitter way, but in a way that made Avery pause. I smiled because I realized something in that moment. I was still here. I still had a future, even if it wasn't the one I had planned. And that smile, though small, was mine. No one could take that from me. I walked back to my desk, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something resembling peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the days went on, the weight of what had happened began to settle into a strange kind of numbness. I was still there, still working, but every day felt like I was moving through someone else's life, someone else's story. The rhythms of the office, the constant buzz of phones, the quiet shuffle of papers, were becoming a blur. And Avery? She was everywhere now. It was like she was waiting for me to break, to show that I was unraveling, but I kept it all in. I had to. The worst part wasn't the fact that she had taken my job. It wasn't even that she had been with Tom. What really gnawed at me was how she seemed so unfazed by everything. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the hurt she'd caused. She just went on with her life like nothing had happened. I would catch her glancing at me occasionally, but when our eyes met, she would quickly look away. Maybe she felt guilty. Maybe she didn't. But I wasn't about to make her feel better about it. She had to live with the truth, not me. The hardest part was trying to keep up appearances. When I got home at the end of the day, I had to pretend everything was fine for the sake of my children. They were young, 12 and 8, and I didn't want them to see how broken I felt. I didn't want them to think I was weak. So, I smiled when I could, joked when I needed to, and pretended to be okay. But at night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I would lie in bed and let the tears come. There were moments when I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. That I couldn't keep pretending. But then I would think of my kids, how they needed me, how they needed to know that even in the face of everything, I would keep going. And I did. A few weeks passed, and I found myself falling into a routine. The office wasn't as unbearable as it had been. I had accepted the fact that Avery was in charge now. There was a cold kind of relief in the resignation, in knowing that I didn't have to fight for control anymore. I could just exist in my new, diminished role, and no one would expect me to be anything more than a shadow of what I used to be. But there was still that uncomfortable presence, Avery. She was always there, hovering, making suggestions that were meant to feel helpful but felt like little jabs. Every time she asked me something about the work, she seemed to be testing me, seeing if I would crack. I didn't. Not in front of her. One afternoon, Greg called me into his office again. I knew something was coming, I could feel it in the air. Avery had been working closely with him recently, and there were murmurs in the office about her potential for a bigger role. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what he had to say, but I went anyway. "Catherine," Greg said, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. "I wanted to check in with you. We've been thinking about your future here, and I know it's been a difficult transition." It was impossible to read his tone. Was he trying to be kind? Or was he just doing his job? I couldn't tell. "Yeah, it has been," I said quietly, not sure how much I was willing to open up. "I'm adjusting. Trying to." Greg nodded, then leaned forward slightly. Listen, I know things haven't been easy. But we think it's time for you to start considering other options. We've been talking about restructuring, and we want to offer you a position elsewhere within the company. Something more flexible, part-time. We'd still like you to stay with us. I blinked, trying to make sense of what he was saying. A part-time role. Was he pushing me out, or was he giving me an out? Either way, the words felt like a slap. I see, I said, my voice even, though inside I felt the anger starting to rise. So, you're offering me less work. Less responsibility. Not less responsibility, Greg said quickly. Just a different kind of responsibility. We think a part-time role would suit your current situation. I clenched my jaw. And what's my current situation supposed to be, Greg? He hesitated, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Look, Catherine. You've been through a lot. And we know that. But we also need to think about what's best for the team, for the company. Avery's been stepping up, and Avery, I interrupted, not able to hold back the bitterness in my voice. Of course. She's been stepping up. Greg cleared his throat. It's not personal. It's just about the company's needs. I stood up, suddenly feeling like I was suffocating in the room. Right. Well, I'll think about it. But I didn't need to think about it. I already knew the answer. I was being pushed out, and no amount of sugarcoating could change that. I walked out of Greg's office, my head spinning with everything I had just heard. Avery had won. She had everything now, the job, the position, the power, and I was left with the scraps. It wasn't just about losing my career, it was about losing a sense of who I was. The next few days felt like a blur. I kept going through the motions at work, pretending that I was okay, pretending that I wasn't hurt by everything that had happened. Avery seemed to pick up on it, though. She began to act even more smug, more self-assured. She would breeze past me in the hallway, her heels clicking on the floor with a confidence that made my stomach twist. She knew what she had done. She knew how much it had broken me. And she didn't care. But something changed in me, too. As the days wore on, I started to get angry. I was angry at Greg for treating me like I was disposable. I was angry at Avery for taking everything from me, for destroying my family in ways I would never fully understand. But most of all, I was angry at myself for letting it all happen. One day, after a particularly frustrating meeting where Avery had been uncomfortably close to taking over a project I had worked on for months, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew it was time to stop pretending. I needed to stand up for myself, even if it meant walking away from this place, from everything that had once been mine. That evening, I made up my mind. I would have one final conversation with Greg. It wouldn't be easy, and I wasn't sure what I would say, but I knew I had to do it. I couldn't let him or Avery continue to dictate the terms of my life. I took a deep breath as I walked to his office. This time, there would be no masks, no pretending. The door closed behind me. I stood outside Greg's office for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. A deep breath filled my chest, steadying the nerves that had been rattling inside of me for days. The anger, the betrayal, all of it had been building inside me like a storm. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep letting them treat me like I was nothing. I walked in, the door clicking shut behind me. Greg was sitting at his desk, reviewing some papers, but he looked up when I entered, a small, surprised frown crossing his face. "Catherine," he said, standing up. "What's this about?" "I thought we were on track to discuss your transition. Sit down, Greg," I cut him off, my voice firm. "This isn't about my transition." Greg hesitated, his eyes narrowing a bit. But he sat down again, adjusting his glasses. "All right, then. What's going on?" "I've been thinking about your offer," I said, my voice controlled but steady. "The part-time role, the demotion. Everything." He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes darted to the side, probably wondering where this was going. I could tell he wasn't expecting this confrontation. He probably thought I'd just nod and accept whatever he threw my way. Well? Greg prodded, the discomfort clear in his tone. I leaned forward, placing my hands on his desk. Here's the thing, Greg, I said, looking him directly in the eyes. You've made a lot of decisions about me without even thinking to ask me how I felt. You've decided my future, my worth, as if my grief and my life don't matter anymore. You pushed me out. But what you didn't account for was this. I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. The silence stretched, and I could see that Greg was starting to get a little defensive, maybe even worried. You think this is just about a job to me, I continued. About staying in the background while Avery takes over. But it's not. This is about my dignity, Greg. You tried to strip that away from me. You and Avery both. But I'm not just going to sit here and let that happen. Not anymore. Greg's face tightened, and I could tell he was gearing up for a response. But I wasn't finished. I've been here for years. Years, Greg. I've built something here. I've worked hard, I've given everything. And now, you think I'm just going to walk away from that without a fight? Well, I've got news for you. I'm done playing by your rules. I leaned back slightly, watching him squirm just a little bit. He didn't know what to say. He probably expected me to fall apart, to take the part-time job and just quietly fade into the background. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I'm not going to accept a part-time position, I said, slowly and deliberately. And I'm not going to sit here and let Avery take everything. If I'm leaving, it's on my own terms. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Catherine, listen, you have to understand. No, Greg, I interrupted, not letting him finish. You don't understand. What you and Avery did to me isn't just business. You both took something from me, something that can't be replaced. But you've underestimated me. I'm not broken. And I'm certainly not going to be sidelined by you. I could see the frustration starting to grow on Greg's face. But instead of backing down, I pressed on, pulling the final piece of my plan together. I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice, I said, my voice steady, but with a hard edge that felt empowering. And here's the thing, you're going to regret making me feel like I had no options. Because while you've been planning for Avery's promotion and celebrating her so-called success, I've been planning my exit. I've been networking. I've been reaching out to old contacts. And guess what? I have an offer. A better one. And I'm taking it. Not because you pushed me out, but because I can do better than this. I deserve better than this. Greg's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth as if to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. This conversation is over, Greg, I said, more firmly than I thought I was capable of. I'm leaving. And the best part? You're going to have to explain to the rest of the team why you lost me. Why the person who kept everything running smoothly for so long is walking out the door. I paused, letting that sink in, and then stood up, the adrenaline flowing through me, giving me the strength I needed to finally take control. You're not going to replace me with Avery. You can't. Not without the consequences. The team won't trust her. They'll see it. They'll know. And if you think you can just sweep this under the rug, you're wrong. I walked toward the door, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction with every step. I turned to face him one last time. Good luck with your promotion for Avery, Greg. You're going to need it. But don't worry, I won't be here to watch you fail. I walked out, my heart pounding but my head clearer than it had been in weeks. I had just taken control of my life again. I had given myself the power back, and there was nothing more satisfying than that. I gave my notice and spent the next 2 weeks preparing to leave the company I had been a part of for so long. I didn't want to make this about revenge. I wasn't interested in being petty or cruel. I simply wanted to reclaim what had been taken from me. And when the day came for me to leave, it wasn't about the job anymore. It wasn't about Greg or Avery. It was about me. I took a deep breath as I packed up my things from my desk, looking around the office one last time. Avery was sitting at her desk, looking over some files, her expression unreadable. But when she saw me, something flashed in her eyes. Maybe it was fear, maybe guilt, but I didn't care. "Goodbye, Avery," I said, my voice steady, and even though she didn't respond, I knew she had heard me. It was time for me to go, but not just from the office. I was leaving the past behind, too. I walked out of that building with my head held high, knowing I was making the right choice for myself and my future. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was the one I needed. I was free. And as I drove away, I smiled to myself. Because I knew that the future ahead of me was mine to create. And I would do it on my terms. That was my victory. And no one, not Greg, not Avery, could ever take that away from me.